front of me, so you can't talk about me today, okay?
Yeah, last week we had that giant sandwich before we started, but you do have a giant sandwich in a bag, so we can hold off on that,
I
right?
have bird food, but I promise not to eat it while I'm talking on the air. But today we are in the midst of Black History Month, and each year the Library of Congress, they highlight a theme. So this year, the theme is Black women, American history and culture. I like that.
I like it too.
Our discussion last
Good
week
topic.
about Black women and race. But today on the Barbershop Show, it's all about Ivy Wells. There's so much to say about her life and her legacy here in Chicago and in the world of art.
We're going to have a lot of conversation today. We're joined at the shop by Christopher Manning, who is Associate Professor of History at Loyola University, and Michelle Duster, who has written much about Ivy B. Wells and is also related. What are you, great-granddaughter?
Yes.
Great-granddaughter. And Christopher, it's a pleasure to have you here too.
Glad to be here.
Oh, we need your microphone. Okay.
Oh, glad to be here.
Okay, because we want to make sure that the people know you're here, right? Richard Hunt is an award-winning sculptor who has designed a monument commemorating Ivy B. Wells, and he'll join us a little bit later. Well, I guess the first thing we need to know is who
Is she? Who is she? And what do you have to know about her in order to really know her?
I think we should go to the great-granddaughter
Yeah.
first for that.
You know the inside.
She was tough, too.
So you want to know, like, what kind of personality she has?
Well, for people who don't know who she is,
Yeah,
who is she?
before that, I mean, you know, the
The
fact
primer.
that, you know,
Oh, okay.
yeah, coming from Mississippi.
Ivy Wells 101.
You know, coming from Mississippi, or being born in Mississippi, moving to Memphis and all of that, but before the real activist stages of her life took place, very early on, homegirl.
Well, the thing that I feel is important for people to know when I do talk about what I think helped shape who she was is there are several things. I mean, first of all, she was born a slave in 1862, so it was right in the middle of the Civil War. And she, you know, the Civil War ended in 1865, so she was not a slave very long. And I would guess that she probably didn't remember very much of that experience. So she came of age during Reconstruction, which I think is a very important part of her history because she became educated, which was, you know, she was one of the first generations of African Americans to have the opportunity to become educated right after the Civil War. And she grew up during a period of time when there was a lot of progress for people who had been former slaves they got the right to vote, they could own property, they could own businesses for the first time, you know. So I think that was really important because she grew up during a period of hope, but then there was a huge backlash that happened as a result of the progress that a lot of people made. So I think the fact that she grew up feeling and actually experiencing a lot of freedoms and rights, and then to have that revoked, I think that impacted her a great deal to help her become an activist.
I also read that her father, because he became emancipated after the Civil War, he was pretty involved in politics, or politically for that time, you know.
Absolutely.
So, taking a look at the landscape and determining that, you know, he should be involved.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think her father was a big influence on her gaining confidence in what her abilities were, and also teaching her how to speak up for herself and being willing to take the consequences of standing up for herself. I mean, one example that I think is really important is her father took the opportunity to vote. And because he voted one way that was the opposite of what his former master felt he should vote, his father lost his business. He was a carpenter. The former master locked up all the tools, and they basically got thrown out of the house. And so Ida was old enough to remember seeing her father being willing to, you know, take a hit for what he believed in, and he didn't back down from that. And her father was very involved in a lot of the local politics. He was a trustee of Shaw University, which is now Russ College, so he was very active in the community. And he encouraged Ida to read the newspaper to his friends. They would have meetings over at the house with, you know, his friends who were men. And so I think she got a chance to speak in front of a group of men at a young age, and I think that probably helped build her confidence and, you know, her ability to speak to people and not be intimidated by it.
Now, she had a huge impact in the Chicago area. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, obviously we have, you know, things all over the city with her name on it. You know, can you talk about how that came to light and how she kind of came to Chicago and made her mark?
Well, she came to Chicago at the invitation of Frederick Douglass in 1893. There was the Columbian Exposition, World's Fair, taking place at that time, and she had already gained a national reputation from her writing, and so Frederick Douglass knew who she was and was impressed with her, and he actually acted sort of as a mentor to her because he was about 40 years older than her.
How did she meet Frederick Douglass?
Well, that's what happened. He asked her to come to Chicago because the Columbian Exposition was happening, and there were a group of people that decided that they weren't happy with the lack of representation of African Americans participating in the World's Fair, and he and several other people had thought, well, maybe we should write a pamphlet to help people understand how African Americans are being treated in this country, and why, to explain why people who are visiting the Columbian Exposition will not see that many African Americans participating. And he asked her to come to Chicago. She was living in New York at the time. And he asked her to come to Chicago to help him work on this pamphlet. So as far as I know, that was maybe the first time she had met him in person. I mean, they had had some communication beforehand through letters. And so she came here to Chicago specifically to work on the pamphlet.
They encouraged a boycott, right?
Yeah.
They encouraged the boycott of the Columbian Exposition because I had felt very strongly that if African Americans are not represented in an equal way, then they should not participate as, you know, visitors.
The thing that I think is kind of interesting is I hear you talk about this and what you was writing about. You can write those stories today about various things, employment,
sure,
income, and, you know, look at the segregation in neighborhoods in Chicago. I think some of these issues are still very much relevant, even though this happened so long ago.
I want to ask this question, and I want to backtrack a little bit, Christopher. Historically, either one of you, but I'm sure you know this history. One of the things that really, you know, moved her forward in terms of being an activist are some things that happened to her in Memphis. She came as a student. And the other thing about the family thing, which I think is important, after her parents died, she had all the children. 6, 7 of her brothers and sisters.
Right. Well, Ida was one of the. She was one of 8 children. She was the oldest, and one of her siblings died along with her parents during the yellow fever epidemic, which happened in 1878 when Ida was 16 years old, and another one of her siblings had passed away before that. So there were 5 remaining siblings in addition to Ida, and she took it upon herself at the age of 16 to keep her siblings together. Because there was an effort to break them apart, you know, pretty much like what would be considered foster care today. And she refused to have her siblings separated because they had already lost their parents.
Sure.
So she didn't want to lose her siblings as well.
Christopher, here's a question I wanted to ask them about.
But before, I just want to know.
Oh, yeah, well, you should do that.
I should do that.
Yes, tap me on the shoulder.
I'll tap you. If you're just now tuning in, you're listening to the Barbershop Show on United.FM. You can get on this conversation too. I know we have a lot of questions, but you know you can ask yours as well by calling 888-635-1112. That's 888-635-1112. You can also follow the show by tweeting it at Chicago Reporter. Okay.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Now we get the question.
This has to do with early on, you know, before coming to Chicago, and you know, some of what formed her ideas about things that she needed to do in relationship to African Americans. When she was in Memphis, she became the editor of a newspaper. And she did these fiery editorials about anti-lynching and things involving African Americans that made her not very well liked in Memphis. And as a matter of fact, there were 3 associates that was friends of hers that were lynched, were killed.
Right, right.
And that really spurred her to make some moves. All of that had to do with eventually having her having come to Chicago. Kind of a matter of at some point it wasn't safe to remain in Memphis.
Well, it really wasn't safe. And even in addition to that, we have to recognize that the time when she came of age during Reconstruction and Redemption, while it was a period in which there were a lot of opportunities, those opportunities were put down by violence. So you have the development of the Knights of the White Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, and various efforts to prevent people from voting. And that was enforced not by just telling you not to vote or losing your job. That was enforced at the point of a gun. You know, people were shot, Republicans were run out of the South, and it was a violent takeover of those politics. Now, she was 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old when that was going on. So for her father to be involved in politics and local affairs was a huge deal, because that was something that could have led him to lose his life at any moment. So we have to really recognize that her formative early adult years were in the midst of some of the worst violence that African Americans had seen in this country. So perhaps that was why, when she got in a position where she was working for a newspaper, she began to expose some of the things that were going on in lynching. Now, for the time period in which it was occurring, lynchings were often attributed to bad black behavior, in quotes, individuals who were acting out of their so-called racial place. But she found that more often it occurred when blacks were in economic competition with whites and doing well, which was the case with the lynching of the Curve, where her 3 friends were lynched because their grocery store was actually quite successful.
Across the street from a white grocery store.
Across the street from a white grocery store. And she also exposed the myth of lynching as being attributed to rape by African American women of white men, when in fact it more often occurred that it was consensual relations. In fact, that line that she put in that editorial was probably the line that got her run out of Memphis for exposing that falsehood, that myth.
And the New York Times said some really nasty things about her in relationship to that comment and the whole issue of, I guess, her lack of purity.
Yeah.
At least that was the position they took.
Well, that's also a cultural thing at the time. I mean, who was a black woman to comment on the purity of whites, much less white women, relative to issues of sexuality in the South? She had really gone out of her place. She had really stepped out of her bounds. And that points back to that toughness that you were talking about before. She was exhibiting that toughness when she was barely into her 20s, and would keep doing it by the time she moved up here.
I think it's kind of interesting, just kind of bringing the conversation back to, what's happening today. I mean, I feel like a lot of people still don't know, at least the younger generation, about Ida B. Wells in Chicago. I mean, is that true? But also you have, institutions, like I said, with her name on it, but then you have things like the public housing development that was recently demolished within the last, 5 to 10 years that had her name on it. I mean, what is her legacy today, and how do you feel about that when you saw those, buildings coming down?
It's kind of hard for me to really know exactly what her legacy is to other people. I mean, I think it sort of varies depending on the person. Some people, I think a lot of people think of her specifically when it comes to the anti-lynching per se, and they don't really know a lot of the other work that she did. There are some people that the only thing they know about Ida B. Wells is that a project was named after her, and that's their only reference point. And unfortunately, at this point, it's sort of viewed in a negative way for people who did not live in the community. And then among some other people, they know her more as a suffragist. That's what they focus on when it comes to the work that she did.
She sat with Susan B. Anthony and who else? The lady here in Chicago with Hillhouse.
Jane Addams.
She got with them at the race. So
Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, I've met a lot of groups of women in particular who, as soon as you mentioned Ida B. Wells, like, oh wow, she was so involved in the suffrage movement, and they don't really focus so much on the journalism. So I really kind of it depends on sort of the vantage point of the person that you're talking to. There are a lot of African American men that I've met definitely focus on the lynching part, because she was defending, black men for the most part when it comes to, most of the lynching was against men. So they view her as a hero, that sort of stood up and helped defend, the men in the community. So.
And the interesting part about that too is, unless I missed something, over the years there has never been an anti-lynching law.
No, there hasn't.
In Congress.
And I just want to add something else on to the legacy, because really, when you look at her legacy, it kind of has 4 parts.
Can you hold 4 parts?
Hold it, Hold it.
All right. We're going to do this first. This is the Barbershop Show, live from Carter's Barbershop in North Lawndale until 1 o'clock this afternoon. After the break, Ida B. Wells will talk more about her in Chicago and some other aspects of her life.
We'll hear from Chris.
I can think about 4 parts.
Yeah, right. We'll do that right after this.